Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're taking something that seems pretty simple, maybe even just fun Swiss fondue, and peeling back the layers.
Yeah, we're going way beyond just melted cheese here.
Exactly. We want to expose the surprising history, the economics, everything lying just underneath that communal pot.
It's fascinating, really. You think fondue, you think parties, maybe skiing.
Right.
But the source material, these old recipes from the 1600s, the cheese union archives from the 20th century, they tell a totally different story.
It's a story about, well, national identity, some pretty shrewd economics, and just pure basic necessity. So our mission today is really to dig into that big contradiction. How did this dish, which started because people in the Alps were, frankly, isolated and had very little, become this polished global symbol of Swiss hospitality and, togetherness?
And the sources we have are fantastic for tracing that exact journey. We've got the earliest known recipe, like you said, from a 1699 Zürich manuscript.
Wow, 1699.
Yeah. And then we jump forward to the 1930s, looking at the Swiss Cheese Union's archives, which are, let's just say, very strategic.
Sounds intriguing.
It lets us track centuries of how this dish changed culturally.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning with the hardship. You mentioned the Alps, 17th century. Paint us a picture.
Right. So you have to imagine these long, incredibly harsh winters. We're talking serious isolation up in the mountains.
Shut off completely.
Pretty much, yeah. Once the snows hit, villages were on their own. No fresh food coming in.
So what did they eat?
They survived on what lasted. And that meant really hard aged cheese and very, very stale bread, dried out, tough stuff.
Okay, so they had food, but it wasn't exactly appetizing.
Not at all. The challenge wasn't necessarily having food. It was making this hard, almost inedible stuff warm, palatable, and easier to digest.
And that's where the genius comes in, right? The simple solution. They've got this hard cheese, stale bread. What do?
They figured out that melting the cheese, usually with some wine, made all the difference. It softened everything, made it warm, communal.
So moisture and heat, wine was the key.
Wine was crucial, yeah. Fondue, back then, it wasn't fancy food. It was purely utilitarian, a way for villagers together to make their limited supplies work.
Kind of a collective invention.
Exactly, not some chef's creation. It was, zero-waste thinking born out of just trying to get by.
And we actually know when this started getting written down. You mentioned that manuscript.
That's right, the 1699 Zürich manuscript. It's the first known recipe we have. But interestingly,
What?
it wasn't called fondue back then.
I just assumed.
Nope. The title was in German, Käse mit Wein zu kochen, simply to cook cheese with wine. Very straightforward.
Huh. So when did the name fondue come in?
That French term, from fondre, meaning to melt, that didn't really catch on until the 19th century. That's when the dish started moving, beyond just those isolated mountain areas.
And geographically, you mentioned specific cheeses earlier, like Gruyère and Emmental. Does that pin the origins down a bit more?
Oh, definitely. The history points strongly to the French-speaking parts of Switzerland.
Like Freiburg.
Exactly. Freiburg, Vaud, Neuchâtel. These were, and still are, the places where Gruyère and Emmental are traditionally made.
So the dish grew up where the cheese was.
Makes sense, right. You needed that local knowledge. Knowing how these specific hard cheeses behaved when you melted them with acid and heat, they were the perfect foods for scarcity.
Okay, so fast forward a bit. Early 20th century, fondue is this regional, hearty, practical meal. But then things change. Part 2, the marketing. How does it go national?
This is where it gets really interesting economically speaking. The big shift happens in the 1930s.
The Depression era.
Right. And fondue goes from being this regional thing to a national symbol almost overnight. And it's because the Swiss Cheese Union, the USC, stepped in.
The cheese union. Okay, why?
Well, it wasn't purely about celebrating tradition, let's put it that way.
I suspected what was the real reason.
They had a massive cheese surplus problem.
Oh, yeah.
Especially hard cheeses. After World War I and heading into the Depression, Swiss people weren't eating enough cheese domestically, and exports were down.
So they had warehouses full of Gruyere.
Pretty much.
Right.
They needed a way to get the Swiss population to eat more cheese. A lot more cheese.
So fondue became the vehicle. It was basically a campaign to offload surplus cheese, but dressed up as national heritage.
That's a blunt way to put it, but yeah. It was incredibly clever marketing. They needed to make eating cheese, specifically melted cheese, in this communal way, feel normal, even patriotic.
How did they do it? Just posters saying, eat fondue.
Oh, it was much more sophisticated. They pushed fondue recipes into army cookbooks.
Into the military.
Yep. If you were a Swiss soldier, you learned to make and eat fondue. It was in school cafeterias, institutional canteens. They ran radio ads, handed out glossy recipe cards. They made it seem like the quintessential Swiss experience.
Wow.
They framed it as unity, identity,
Yeah.
not just, using up old cheese stock.
So they weaponized tradition to solve an inventory crisis.
And it was incredibly successful. By the time World War II ended, fondue had sort of shed those purely economic origins in the public mind.
It took on a new meaning.
Yeah, it became something deeper. A symbol of comfort, peace, hospitality in that post-war era. It felt simple, communal, warm, everything people craved after years of conflict.
And that warmth, that good feeling, gets captured in that famous Swiss saying, right?
Absolutely. It became like the unofficial slogan. Fondue ist gut und gibt a gute Lohn.
Which translates to?
Fondue is good and creates a good mood. Simple, direct, and perfectly link the food to positive emotion.
But that good mood really depends on getting the fondue right. No one's happy with a lumpy, oily mess.
Oh, definitely not.
Which brings us neatly to part 3, the science of the melt. It seems simple, but it's so easy to mess up.
It's surprisingly tricky for what seems like just cheese and wine. First, the gear matters. You need that heavy ceramic pot, the caquelon,
Right,
and the little burner underneath, the rechaude, for steady, low heat. That's key.
And the ingredients, you can't just throw any old cheese in there, can you?
Sadly, no. Cheddar fondue isn't really a thing traditionally. You need that classic mix.
Gruyère and Emmental.
Exactly. Gruyere gives you the flavor, the depth, the saltiness. Emmental gives you that lovely stretchiness, the elasticity, and a milder taste. Plus, you need a dry white wine and something to stabilize it, like cornstarch or flour.
Okay, now the crucial bit, the
Yeah.
secret. Why the wine? And why does it have to be dry, acidic wine? What's the magic?
Okay, this is the cool chemistry part. Cheese is basically milk proteins caseins surrounded by fat globules.
Right.
When you just heat cheese, those proteins tighten up, squeeze out the fat, and you get rubbery clumps and grease. Disaster.
The dreaded separation.
Exactly. But the acid in dry wine, we're talking tartaric acid, malic acid, it interferes with that process. It basically helps keep the casein proteins from clumping together too tightly. The acid ions attach to the proteins, giving them a slight negative charge, so they repel each other instead of glomming together. It acts like an emulsifier.
So the acid keeps everything smooth and suspended. It's not just flavor.
It's fundamental to the texture. Without enough acid, you get that oily separation. It's chemistry keeping your dinner together.
Mind blown. Okay, what about actually making it? Stirring technique.
Patience and constant motion. Usually toss the cheese with the cornstarch first, then melt it gradually into the warm wine, and you have to stir constantly.
The figure 8 thing.
Yeah, the figure 8 motion is traditional. It helps distribute the heat evenly and keeps those proteins moving, preventing hot spots and clumps.
And the biggest mistake people make. The absolute no-no.
Letting it boil. Never, ever boil fondue.
Why not?
Too much heat makes the protein seize up instantly. The acid can't keep up, the emulsion breaks, and boom, oil slick. Low, gentle, steady heat is everything. That's why the rechaude burner is so important.
Got it. Low and slow. And then there are those little extras, right? The flavor touches.
Absolutely. The classic way involves rubbing the inside of the caquelon with a cut clove of garlic first, then a grating of nutmeg for warmth, and often, right at the end, a little splash of kirsch.
Cherry brandy. Does that make it taste like cherries?
Not really. The alcohol cooks off quickly, but it adds this subtle aromatic complexity that just lifts the cheese flavor. It's a finishing touch.
That whole idea, simplicity but elevated by technique in these small details, that really captures why fondue is more than just food, doesn't it?
It really does. It's a ritual. Part 4 is really about that, the melting expression of friendship.
Yeah.
Eating fondue isn't just a meal, it's a cultural cornerstone in Switzerland. Everyone dipping into the same pot.
Sharing the caquelon.
Exactly. That act itself, sharing that central point of warmth, it symbolizes unity, friendship. It echoes back to those early Alpine communities sharing scarce resources.
It's amazing that something born from just managing old food has kept such a powerful meaning, especially around holidays or skiing.
It really embodies core Swiss values. Warmth, togetherness, finding balance, and it's inspired other things, like chocolate fondue, of course.
Of course.
But the original cheese fondue, done right, it's still rooted in that elemental mix. Cheese, fire, friendship. Simplicity elevated, really.
What a journey we've traced today. From, 17th century mountain folk figuring out how to eat stale bread and hard cheese.
Out of pure necessity.
A massive marketing campaign by the cheese union in the 30s to shift surplus stock.
Yeah, turning a problem into an icon.
And finally, emerging as this globally recognized symbol of peace, comfort, and Swiss identity, it really is a story of melting hardship into harmony.
A pretty incredible transformation, turning scarcity into something celebrated.
Which leaves us with a thought for you, our listeners. If a dish that started purely from the struggle to survive harsh, isolated conditions could become such a potent symbol of peace and community, especially after WWII, what does that tell us about our fundamental human need for shared rituals, for communal warmth, particularly when times are tough? Are there other everyday foods, maybe things born from necessity in different cultures, that carry that same kind of deep cultural weight today? Something to think about next time you share a meal.